The train shuddered, its rhythmic clatter a metronome marking the slow decay of the landscape outside my window. For 2 hours, the dense, orderly suburbs of Boston had gradually thinned, giving way to sparse woodland, then to marshy flats that smelled of salt and low tide. Now there was only the gray, churning Atlantic on one side, and wind-swept dunes choked with poverty grass on the other. My name was Arthur Penhaligon, and in the autumn of 1919, my profession was a peculiar one. I was a land assessor for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It was a job that sounded grander than it was, a bureaucratic calling that traded in deeds, surveys, and the unglamorous but necessary truth of plotted lines on paper. My work was to ensure that the Commonwealth's holdings were precisely as the records stated they were, a task that usually involved trudging through forgotten state forests or confirming the boundaries of dreary municipal buildings. This assignment, however, felt different. It carried a weight that had settled in my stomach the moment I'd read the file. Seacliff. The name itself was a stark piece of poetry. My destination was the Seacliff State Hospital, formerly the Seacliff Sanatorium, perched on a desolate point of coastline an hour's walk from the nearest proper town of Port Blossom. My task was to conduct a full survey and structural verification of the main building and its grounds. The state was planning a new infectious disease ward, and they needed to know, down to the inch, what they were building on and around. It was rote work, but the file had an addendum, a single crisp sheet of paper that had been paper-clipped to the primary survey request. It was a note from my superior, a man named Abernathy, whose handwriting was as dry and spidery as his personality. Penhaligon, it read, pay special attention to the west-facing elevation. Records from 1904 indicate the demolition of the original west wing. Confirm demolition and ensure foundation lines are clear. There are budgetary discrepancies from that period. Lay it to rest. Lay it to rest. An odd turn of phrase for a property assessment. The train hissed to a stop at a lonely outpost that was little more than a wooden platform and a sign reading Port Blossom. The air that hit me as I stepped down was cold and heavy with the undiluted brine of the ocean. It was a clean smell, but one without joy, the scent of immense, indifferent power. A single tired-looking Ford was waiting for me. The driver, a taciturn man in his 50s, who didn't offer his name and seemed annoyed that I had arrived at all. We drove in silence along a pock-marked road that hugged the coastline. The sky was a uniform, oppressive sheet of slate. And then I saw it. Seacliff's sanatorium did not rise from the landscape so much as it clung to it, a monstrous granite barnacle on the edge of the world. It was a sprawling 4-story granite edifice of dark, sea-stained granite and slate, a chaotic marriage of Victorian Gothic and stark institutional necessity. Turrets and gables born of the Gilded Age, when it was a private retreat for the wealthy suffering from consumption, jutted out at odd angles, their decorative flourishes now looking like skeletal fingers against the pale sky. Newer, plainer wings of brick and concrete had been grafted onto the original structure with a brutal lack of sympathy, creating a disjointed, almost unsettling silhouette. The entire compound was surrounded by a low stone wall, and the wind, coming in unimpeded off the Atlantic, moaned as it whipped around the corners of the building, a constant, low, mournful sound. The driver stopped the car at the main gate, a wrought-iron affair greened with verdigris. "This is it," he grunted, not bothering to look at me. "Someone's expecting you at the administration office, north side." He took my fare, turned the car around in a spray of gravel, and was gone, leaving me alone with the immense silent building and the sighing of the wind. I stood there for a long moment, my leather satchel in hand, feeling the profound, almost gravitational pull of the place. It didn't feel like a hospital. It felt like a tomb that had forgotten its purpose. The air smelled of salt, wet stone, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible antiseptic scent, the ghost of carbolic acid that seemed to be weeping from the very pores of the granite. I walked through the gate, my footsteps echoing unnervingly on the flagstone path. The administration office was in one of the newer, less imposing wings. Inside, the antiseptic smell was stronger, mingled with the scent of boiled cabbage and floor polish. The edifice was an exercise in drab functionality, beige walls, scuffed linoleum floors, and the endless quiet rustle of paper. A stern-faced woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, the hospital administrator, greeted me with a limp handshake. She was a woman who seemed to be eroded by her surroundings, her face a mask of weary competence. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said, her voice flat, "we've been expecting you. Your work is a formality, I trust." "I am simply here to verify the state's property records, madam," I replied, keeping my own tone neutral. "I'll require access to the building's original blueprints if they are on site, as well as any and all surveys conducted since the state acquired the property in 1902. She nodded slowly, her eyes impassive. "The records are in the basement archive. Our groundskeeper, Mr. Croft, can show you. He knows the building better than anyone. He's been here since it was a state hospital." She gave a thin, dismissive wave. "Try not to disturb the patients." With that, she turned back to her paperwork. The audience concluded. Silas Croft was a man who looked as though he'd been carved from the same granite as the sanatorium itself. I found him in a small, cluttered workshop behind the main building, sharpening the blade of a head shear with a whetstone. The sound was a rhythmic, grating shing, shing, shing that set my teeth on edge. He was perhaps 70, with a face like a wind-battered coastline, all crags and deep-set shadows. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, regarded me with a profound lack of interest as I introduced myself. "Surveyor," he said, the word coming out like a puff of dust. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt floor. "State's always counting its pennies and its inches." "I need to see the basement archives, Mr. Croft. Mrs. Gable said you could show me." He wiped the shear with an oily rag, taking his time. The silence in the small shed stretched, filled only by the ceaseless moan of the wind outside. He looked at me up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal. "Archives are down below. Place is a maze. You looking for something specific or just making work for yourself?" "I need to verify the demolition of the old West Wing," I said, trying to sound matter-of-fact. Croft stopped what he was doing. He set the shear down with a metallic clink. He didn't look at me, but stared at a point on the wall just past my shoulder. The air in the shed grew thick and still. "Demolition," he repeated, his voice a low rumble. "That's what the paper says, is it? The county records from 1904 are quite clear." He finally turned his pale eyes on me. They were not hostile, but held a strange, deep-seated weariness, like a man who has carried a heavy secret for a lifetime. "Paper says a lot of things, son. Paper doesn't have to live with the stones. Some things, they aren't demolished. They're just made quiet." He picked up a heavy ring of iron keys that looked as ancient as the building. "Come on, then. See for yourself what the paper says." He led me not through the main hospital, but around the back to a heavy oak door set low in the foundation. The key groaned in the lock. The air that rolled out of the opening was cold and dense, smelling of damp earth, mildew, and the faint metallic scent of forgotten things. We descended a flight of steep stone steps, our footsteps the only sound besides the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the oppressive darkness. He lit a kerosene lantern, its yellow light pushing back the shadows in a small, flickering circle. The basement was a labyrinth of stone-walled corridors and vaulted ceilings, a vast undercroft that seemed to stretch for acres beneath the hospital. Pipes, thick with rust and condensation, snaked across the ceiling. "Archives are this way," Croft grunted, his voice swallowed by the immense space. We walked for what felt like a quarter of a mile, turning down one identical corridor after another. The sheer scale of the foundation was staggering. Finally, he stopped at a metal-caged room filled with wooden shelves, groaning under the weight of ledgers and rolled-up schematics. "Here you are. Knock yourself out." He handed me the lantern. "Don't get lost. Place has a way of turning you around." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway, his silhouette a dark shape against the deeper dark. "You're checking that west wall, you say?" "The area where the wing was demolished, yes." He was silent for a long moment. "When you're down here," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "trust your tape measure more than you trust the maps. That's all I'll say." And with that, he was gone, his footsteps receding until I was alone in the vast, silent, suffocating cold of the Seacliff basement. My first port of call, however, wasn't the basement, but the Port Blossom County Records Office. Before I trusted the hospital's own archives, I needed to see the public record, the source of Abernathy's note. The office was a small, dusty annex of the town hall, presided over by a young woman named Evelyn Reed. She was a stark contrast to the grim inhabitants of Seacliff, perhaps 25, with nervous, intelligent eyes and hands that constantly worried the cuffs of her blouse. The air in the room was thick with the scent of dry paper and beeswax. When I requested the Seacliff property files, specifically the surveys from 1902 to 1905, a flicker of something, apprehension perhaps, crossed her face. "Of course, Mr. Pendelgorn," she said, her voice a little too bright. "They're in the stacks. It might take me a moment to locate them." She disappeared into a narrow aisle between towering shelves of leather-bound volumes. I waited, the silence of the room broken only by the ticking of a large wall clock. It was a good 10 minutes before she returned, carrying not a single neat file, but a large, disorganized cardboard box. Dust plumed from it as she set it carefully on the reading table. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "The files for that period are a bit of a mess. The clerk from back then wasn't the most organized. Everything related to the sanatorium's transfer to the state seems to have been thrown in here." She hovered as I began to sift through the contents. There were deeds of sale, tax assessments, correspondence between lawyers, and then, at the bottom, I found it. The survey map dated April 1904. It was a large, professionally drafted blueprint of the Seacliff property. I unrolled it on the table. It clearly showed the main building, the grounds, the outbuildings, and on the western edge of the main structure there was a large dotted line rectangle with the words West Wing, 1889 to 1903, demolished. A separate notarized document signed by a county surveyor named Elias Vance attested to the demolition due to severe structural instabilities and subsidence. It was all there, official, tidy. "Is that what you were looking for?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked up at her. Her face was pale and she was chewing on her lower lip. She knew something, or suspected something. "It seems to be," I said, carefully, watching her reaction. She didn't look relieved. She looked
disappointed. She glanced towards the door, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Mr. Pendleghorn," she started, then hesitated. "It's probably nothing. It's just, when I was sorting through that box last year, I found something else. It was misfiled. It didn't seem to belong." "What was it?" "It looked like a journal, a physician's logbook or something. It wasn't an official record. It was tucked inside a folder of architectural change orders from the same period." She wrung her hands. "I didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't pleasant. I put it back, but I put it in a different place so it wouldn't get mixed up with the official files again, in case someone who was supposed to see it ever came looking." My pulse quickened slightly. "Where did you put it, Miss Reed?"
She bit her lip, a silent internal battle waging in her eyes. "In the town archives, in the nursing home. My great aunt is the matron there. I took it there for safekeeping. There's an old man there, Mr. Abernathy. He's nearly 100. His father was a mason who worked on the sanatorium back in the day. He talks sometimes, says things that line up with that book." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Please, be careful. The people in this town, they have long memories, but they don't like to use them." The Port Blossom Elder Care Home smelled of boiled potatoes and pine sol, a scent designed to mask the underlying odor of decay. I found Mr. Abernathy in a sunroom, sitting in a wheelchair, a plaid blanket over his lap, staring out at the same gray sea that battered the shores of Seacliff. His skin was like tissue paper, his eyes clouded with cataracts, but when he turned his head at my approach, there was a spark of lucidity in them. I introduced myself gently, explaining I was a historian, interested in the construction of the sanatorium. This was a lie, but a necessary one. "Seacliff," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "My father, he laid stone there, good stone. He was proud of his work." "I'm interested in the West Wing," I said, my voice soft. "I was told it was torn down." Abernathy was silent for a long, long time. I thought perhaps he had fallen asleep. Then a dry, humorless chuckle escaped his lips. "Torn down," he whispered. "That's the story they paid for." He shifted in his chair, the effort seeming to cost him dearly. "My father came home one night. This was 1903, the fall. He was pale, shaken. He'd been working there, on a special job. Him and a dozen other men, all paid in cash, double the rate, all told to keep their mouths shut, or their families would want for work for the rest of their lives." "What was the job, Mr. Abernathy?" I asked, my own throat suddenly dry. The old man stared out the window at the churning sea. He said he had known man would wall up a plague, he burn it. He said what he heard, just once from inside, it wasn't the sound of sickness. "What did he hear?" I asked, my own throat suddenly dry. The old man stared at the churning sea. He said he heard nothing, absolute, total silence, and that was the most terrifying sound he'd ever heard in his life. They called it the quiet job. They paid him to forget, but he never did. He told me, "Son, whatever they put in that wing, they buried it alive." Following Evelyn's directions, I found the matron, a kind but wary woman, who, after seeing the gravity in my eyes, led me to a small locked room in the nursing home's own basement. "Evelyn said this was important," she said, handing me a key. "She's a good girl, worries too much." The room was filled with forgotten town relics, faded flags, trophies, and a small stack of archival boxes. In one, marked "Misc Donations," I found it. It was a handsome leather-bound ledger, the kind a physician would use. The cover was blank, but the spine was embossed with two small gilt letters, A.F. I took it back to my lonely, Spartan room at the Port Blossom Inn, the town's only lodging. With the sound of the wind rattling the window pane and the distant roar of the ocean, I opened the first page.
The handwriting was elegant, precise, and confident. The first entry was dated June 12th, 1903. Patient procurement has been a success. The state, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, has seen fit to transfer to my care 12 male patients from the Worcester Asylum, all deemed irredeemably melancholic or suffering from persistent mania. The official transfer papers list their destination as a new experimental hydrotherapy program here at Seacliff. This is a necessary fiction. Their true purpose is far grander. They are to be the subjects of my great work, the silence cure. My hypothesis is simple, yet revolutionary. The modern world, with its cacophony of stimuli, light, sound, human interaction, is a constant assault upon the fragile mind. It is my belief that by removing all external sensory input, by placing the subject in a state of absolute silence and darkness, the mind can be reset. It will turn inward, confront its own disharmonies, and, in the profound quiet, heal itself. The West Wing has been prepared to my exact specifications. Each of the 12 rooms is a perfect void, soundproofed with cork and horsehair, the windows bricked over, the doors sealed with triple-layered oak and rubber. There is no light, there is no sound. Food will be passed through a silent pantry system. Here, in the womb of nothingness, a new form of man shall be born. I have chosen the name Nihil Therapy, the therapy of nothingness. Good speed to us all. Dr. Alistair Finch.
I sat back, the book resting on my lap. The clinical arrogance, the sheer hubris of the words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty room. I continued to read, my hands turning the brittle pages under the dim electric light. The entries came daily at first, filled with scientific optimism. June 15th, 1903, Day 3. The subjects have been installed. The initial transition was, as expected, chaotic, but now a profound quiet has fallen over the wing. The orderlies stationed outside the main sealed corridor report not a single sound. The silence is perfect. The healing has begun. June 22nd, 1903, Day 10. The first signs of progress. Through the small, shielded observation ports, a concession to my own scientific curiosity, I have noted that the subjects are largely immobile. They sit or lie in their voids, perfectly still. The frantic energy of their former states has dissipated, consumed by the calm of the absolute. My theory holds. The mind, starved of distraction, is beginning to feast upon itself, digesting the sickness within. But then the tone began to shift. The confidence started to fray at the edges, replaced by a thread of confusion, then annoyance. July 5th, 1903, Day 23. A peculiar development. Orderly Thompson reported what he described as a tapping from within patient 7's cell. It was not frantic, but rhythmic, methodical. Tap, tap, tap. I have instructed the orderlies they are not to engage. It is likely a residual motor tic, a final ghost of the overstimulated world being exorcised from the system. It will pass. July 18th, 1903, Day 36. The tapping has not ceased. In fact, it has been adopted. Patients 4 and 9 have now begun. They are not in unison. Their rhythms are distinct, creating a discordant, almost conversational pattern of quiet knocks that permeates the corridor. It is maddening. I have had the corridor entrance padded to deafen the sound. This is an unexpected variable. A group pathology developing in isolation? Impossible. They cannot hear one another. The stories shared on this channel are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or to actual events is purely coincidental. This content is created solely for spine-tingling entertainment. And if this content has value for you, give us a like, subscribe, and share a comment with the community. The handwriting in the journal was becoming less steady, the elegant loops growing jagged and sharp. August 9th, 1903, day 58. The tapping has stopped, all of it, as suddenly as it began. The silence that has returned is different. It is heavier, tense. Before it felt empty, now it feels watchful. I find myself reluctant to approach the wing. The orderlies are uneasy. 2 have resigned, citing nervous exhaustion. Fools, we are on the precipice of a breakthrough, and they flee from shadows. August 27th, 1903, day 76. Today I used the observation port on cell 3 for the first time in weeks. The subject, a man named Gable, formerly prone to violent outbursts, was standing in the center of the room, just standing, facing the door. He did not move. His eyes were open, but they were not looking at anything I could see. I watched him for a full hour. He remained as still as a statue. I checked the other cells. It was the same in all of them. They are all standing, all facing the door, all waiting. The entries became sporadic. Days, then weeks passed between them. The final entries were scribbled, almost illegible, the ink smudged in places as if by a trembling hand. September 19th, 1903, day 99. It has gone wrong, horribly wrong. This is not healing, this is something else. I had an orderly, a brave young man named Peter, open the outer door to the food pantry system today. The stench that came out, dear God, it was not the smell of waste, but of malice, of something psychically spoiled. Peter resigned on the spot, gibbering about a pressure in the air. The food in all 12 pantries was untouched, weeks of it, rotting. They haven't been eating. How are they still standing? October 2nd, 19012. I had to know. I unsealed the observation port on cell 7 again, the first tapper. He was no longer standing. He was crouched in the far corner, his back to me. His hands, dear Lord, his hands. His nail bones were gone. The skin of his fingertips was shredded, worn away to the bone, and I saw what he had been doing. On the stone floor, he had been scratching, not words, not pictures, but lines, thousands upon thousands of parallel lines, meticulously carved into the floor, radiating out from his body like a black sun. He was mapping the silence. October 15th. I can no longer bear it. The silence from that wing is a living thing. It presses on the walls. It seeps into the rest of the sanatorium. The staff is terrified. The other patients are agitated. They feel it too. I have failed. I have not cured these men. I have distilled them. I have boiled away their humanity and left only a terrifying silent residue. They are no longer men. They are vessels for the void I created for them. There is only one course of action left. It cannot be undone, so it must be buried. I have spoken to the board. I have spoken to the county. I have used my family's considerable influence. The official story will be a structural failure, a demolition. It will cost a fortune in bribes and forged documents, but it must be done. We will bring in masons. We will seal it. We will entomb my failure and pray it is never unearthed. The last entry was a single shaky line, dated November 5th, 1903. The work is done. The wall is up. May God have mercy on my soul, for the quiet is now absolute. I closed the book.
My hands were trembling. The wind howled outside, and in the silence of my room it felt as though the sound was trying to claw its way in. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. Abernathy's note, Silas Croft's warning, the old man's memory of the quiet job, Evelyn's nervousness, and now this testament to monstrous pride. The blueprint in the hospital basement was a lie. The county record was a fraud. The West Wing was not gone. It was still there, waiting.
The next morning, I returned to Seacliff. The grey sky seemed to hang lower. The granite walls of the hospital looked darker, more menacing. I bypassed the administration office and went straight to Silas Croft's workshop. He was there, oiling a lawnmower part, the air thick with the smell of gasoline. He looked up as I entered, and his pale eyes seemed to read everything in my face. "Found what you were looking for?" he asked, his voice low. "I found a story. I need to see if it's true. I need to get into the basement, to the west wall." He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "Figured you might. What do you need?" "A sledgehammer and a crowbar." He gave a slow, grim nod. He didn't ask why. He already knew. He led me back to the same basement door, but this time he came with me, carrying the heavy tools as if they were walking sticks. We descended once more into the cold, damp dark. I had my own lantern this time, and our two lights cast dancing, exaggerated shadows on the stone walls. I led the way. My memory of the labyrinthine corridors was surprisingly clear. I was guided by a grim sense of purpose. We walked past the caged archive room, deeper into the foundation, towards the western edge of the building. The air grew colder, stiller. The constant dripping of water ceased. Here, the silence was different. It was the heavy, pressurized silence that Dr. Finch had described in his journal. It felt like walking into a vacuum. "Here," I said, my voice sounding small and thin. We had reached the end of a long corridor. The stonework ahead was seamless, a solid wall, but it wasn't. I ran my hand over it. The mortar was different here, newer, cruder, and the stones themselves didn't quite match the rest of the foundation. This was the wall Mr. Abernathy's father had built. "Here's it," Croft whispered, his voice full of a strange reverence. "Always wondered." There was a row of heavy, rusted metal filing cabinets shoved against the wall, covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. It took both of us, grunting and straining, to move them. They scraped against the concrete floor with a deafening shriek that violated the profound quiet. Behind them, the wall was fully visible. It was about 10 feet wide, floor to ceiling, a scar of newer masonry on the ancient foundation. "Let me," Croft said, taking the sledgehammer. I held my lantern high. He took a wide stance, his old body surprisingly powerful. He swung the hammer. The impact was a deafening crack that echoed back down the corridor. A cloud of mortar dust exploded from the wall. A spiderweb of cracks appeared. He swung again and again. The sound was brutal, an act of violation against the long-kept silence. A brick came loose, then another. Croft grunted, switching to the crowbar, and pried at the opening. A section of the wall collapsed inward with a cascade of brick and crumbling mortar. And an odor rolled out. It was not the smell of death, not the smell of rot I had expected. It was the dry, dusty, indescribably ancient smell, the scent of air that had not moved or been breathed in over 16 years. It was the smell of absolute stillness, and beneath it a faint, metallic, coppery tang, like old blood that had long since turned to rust. Croft stepped back, breathing heavily. "It's through,"
he said. The hole was just large enough for a man to crawl through. A profound, utter blackness lay beyond it. I took a deep breath, the dust and the strange dead air filling my lungs, and pushed my lantern through the opening first. The light cut a trembling swath through the darkness. I saw a corridor, identical to the one we were in, stretching into the black. This was the antechamber, the space between the new wall and the original wall of the west wing. I crawled through the hole, my clothes scraping on the rough brick. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Croft passed the crowbar to me. There, 10 feet from me, was the original basement wall of the west wing, and in it a single, heavy, iron-bound door. It was not bricked over, it was merely sealed, its edges thick with hardened pitch and tar. It was the service entrance Finch had sealed last. I jammed the end of the crowbar into the seam. I put my shoulder into it and pushed. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the ancient seal began to crack. I strained, the muscles in my back screaming. The tar and wood splintered, and with the final groaning shudder, the door swung inward into the darkness. The silence that hit me was a physical force. It was absolute, total, a living entity. I stepped across the threshold, raising my lantern high. I was in a long, narrow corridor. The air here was colder still, and the smell of stale air was layered with something else, something sharp and unpleasant. Along the right-hand wall were 12 identical doors made of thick, dark wood, each with a small sliding metal slot at eye level, the observation ports. They were all closed. My hand was shaking as I reached for the first one. It slid open with a small, dry screech. I put my eye to the opening. Pitch black. The lantern light didn't seem to penetrate it. I angled the lantern, pushing its beam into the small, stone-walled cell. The first thing I saw were the lines, scratched on the floor, into the walls, a dense, mad filigree of parallel marks, overlapping, obsessive. And in the far corner, huddled on the floor, was a shape. It was a skeleton, clad in the rotted remains of a simple cotton uniform. It was crouched in the exact position Finch had described, the back to the door, the skeletal hands in its lap, the finger bones worn to nubs. My breath hitched. I stumbled back from the door, my mind reeling. The logic, the cold, hard reality of it was more horrifying than any ghost story. These men weren't haunting this place. They had simply been left here, left to go mad in the dark, left to starve, left to die, and then left to be forgotten.
Driven by a grim, methodical need to know, I went to the next door. I slid open the port. The same scene. A skeleton. A cell covered in a frantic geometry of scratches. I went to the third and the fourth. Each one was a variation on the same theme of silent, isolated horror. Some were huddled in corners. One was lying flat on its back, its skeletal arms outstretched as if in supplication. Another was slumped against the door itself, and I could see where its own fingers had clawed at the wood, leaving deep gouges before the nails had been worn away. I reached the 7th cell, patient 7, the first tapper. I slid open the port, my stomach churning. The scene was as Finch had described. The skeleton was in the corner, but the scratching on the floor was different. It wasn't just lines. Here, in the center of the frantic vortex of scratches, was a crude circle, and inside the circle 7 words had been painstakingly, deeply carved into the stone, a final testament, scratched out with bone and blood. I leaned closer, angling the lantern to read the desperate epitaph. No cure, only the quiet. It eats. The aftermath was as silent and methodical as the crime itself. I did not go to the police in Port Blossom. I did not speak to Mrs. Gable. I took the train back to Boston the next morning, the physician's journal heavy in my satchel. The image of those scratched words burned into my mind. I went directly to my superior, Abernathy, and laid the journal on his desk. I told him everything. I told him about the wall, the cells, the remains. I told him about Alistair Finch's nihil therapy. To his credit, he did not flinch, but his face grew pale, his dry, spidery features tightening into a mask of grim resolve. He made one phone call to a number deep within the State House. What followed was not a public outcry, but a quiet, efficient, and utterly ruthless cover-up. The state could not afford a scandal of this magnitude. Public trust in its institutions, especially its hospitals, was already fragile. Within a week, a team of men who were not police officers and not doctors arrived at Seacliff in unmarked cars. They were quiet, professional, and thorough. The official report, which I was later forced to sign, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. It stated that during the preliminary survey for the new ward, my team had uncovered a forgotten and improperly sealed catacomb dating back to the sanitarium's original construction, containing the remains of several unidentified laborers from a previously undocumented construction accident in the 1890s. The remains of the 12 men were removed at night, placed in simple pine boxes, and interred in an unmarked plot in the corner of a state-owned cemetery 50 miles inland. Their families, if any were still living, were never notified. They had been erased from the public record in 1903, and now they were being erased from the earth itself. Dr. Alistair Finch, I discovered through my own research, had died peacefully of a stroke in 1912. His obituaries celebrated him as a pioneer in public health, a philanthropist, and a pillar of Boston society. He was never held to account. His name adorned a wing of a prestigious Boston hospital. The West Wing at Seacliff was formally and properly demolished this time, ground down to its foundations, which were then filled with concrete. Nothing was left. My own report, the true one, was classified at the highest level and buried in an archive so deep that it might as well have been sealed behind a brick wall. The state's planned expansion went ahead. A new building was erected where the West Wing once stood. Life, in its inexorable, unthinking way, went on. I resigned from my position as a land assessor a year later. I could no longer look at a blueprint, at a deed, at the neat, confident lines on a piece of paper without thinking of the lies they could tell, the horrors they could conceal. The world, I had learned, was not a map. It was a palimpsest, a document written over and over again, with the old truths faintly, terrifyingly visible beneath the new. Sometimes, even now, decades later, when the world grows too loud, when the noise of the city becomes a cacophony, my mind drifts back to the Massachusetts coast. I think of that granite building clinging to the edge of the continent and the thing that was born within its walls. I learned that day that the most profound horrors are not born of malice, but of monumental arrogance, of a belief that humanity can be perfected, that its flaws can be excised, that the soul can be recalibrated like a machine. Finch did not set out to be a monster. He set out to be a savior. And in his quest to eliminate the noise of madness, he created a silence so perfect, so absolute, that it became a thing of its own, a living void that consumed everything within it. History is not silent, it is merely quieted. Its screams are muffled by time, by redactions, by the cold earth and colder stone that we pile on top of our mistakes. We walk over these unmarked graves every day, on the foundations of buildings whose true stories have been deliberately forgotten. But the stones remember, the wind remembers, the quiet places of the world hold a memory of every cruelty, every act of hubris, every forgotten victim. And sometimes, even now, decades later, when the world grows too loud, when the noise of the city becomes a cacophony, a man with a tape measure and a healthy skepticism stumbles upon a line that doesn't add up, a wall that shouldn't be there, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the silence is broken, and you learn that the dead do not need to speak to tell their story. You only need to be quiet enough to read what they scratched into the walls in the final, maddening dark.